people are hungry for alternatives. And bankruptcy, when understood properly, is an alternative to mental stress and worst case scenario, feeling like it's so bad that you need to do something that's harmful, right?
Welcome to the Rich and Regular podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Julian.
And I'm Kirsten. And today we're talking about bankruptcy.
Wow.
Womp, womp. But also needed. But first I want to shout out to Marley NYC, who left a 5-star review called Much Needed Podcast. It is a long and lengthy review, which I love to read, but I don't have time to read the whole thing. I'll just summarize it. Basically, they said that they appreciate both of us and the podcast. They've been following us since they heard about us on Choose FI, that podcast. And they liked us because it was dope to see a Black couple who was also from the island. Shout out to Haiti and Brooklyn.
Boop, boop, boop.
They read Cashing Out and loved it. They followed the podcast. They've followed us on YouTube, all the things. And then this is the part that I really like. They said, one of your podcast episodes even helped my wife and I reconcile over a financial issue we disagreed on. Look at us saving.
That is a common theme.
Saving marriages.
Well, we just came back from Kingston, Jamaica. We've got to find out a way to talk a little bit more about that experience
We have an episode coming up on it.
Okay, I know. I know. But it's weird to have come back from it and then have to hold on to all those thoughts because it was a really, really great experience. But one of the takeaways was, even there, as far away from home as we were, and as much as that was not the center of the conversation, the most asked question that we got was around working with your partner. Mm-hmm. And so it is a common theme. It's something that we're starting to think about a little bit more. We've thought about it in the past. Obviously, it's a really important part of our story. But I'm glad that is continuing to happen. So shout out to all the couples out there, all the people who are looking for a partner and thinking ahead of the conflict that is inevitable.
Yes. Whether you have a business or not.
Hey, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. If it ain't the business, it's going to be money in general.
That's right.
All right, let's talk bankruptcy, because you've actually been wanting to talk about this for a while. And I was honestly struggling with how to talk about it. But then I saw this trend that is going viral on Instagram and TikTok calling for a debt strike. Have you heard of this?
I don't. Debt strike?
A debt strike. I know.
I feel like at least 6 times a year, there's a new name for something.
Yeah.
And it's what are we calling what we've been calling now?
Exactly. And that's what made me want to talk about this.
What?
But it's a little different, because basically the debt strike is people openly saying that they're done paying their debt. They're tired of doing the right thing and still getting nowhere. So they're just going to stop. And to your point, I should be used to TikTok remixing existing terms and coming up with new words for them. But my first thought when I heard this was, if you're already done paying, why wouldn't you just file for bankruptcy?
My first thought was, you going to jail.
Well, exactly.
I dare you.
But filing for bankruptcy is the thing that prevents punitive measures. And we don't have a debtor's prison anymore. So I don't know that you're going to jail, but you're certainly not going to come out unscathed. And there's a better option. So why not go to the option that the system is already set up for?
We're preparing to have a conversation here about bankruptcy, but you're absolutely right. There is a process for people like that, as opposed to going outside and saying and declaring that you're just not going to pay your debts anymore. Whether my first thought was going to jail, or, they're going to come for you, or your life is about to be miserable. You can't do that. You cannot use other people's money for any reason and not choose to pay them back, unless your plan is to run and keep on running.
I mean, you can, but you have to go through a legal process, which is what the episode is about.
Well, that's different.
No, let's
just go there. Look, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because for several reasons. One, bankruptcy is such a polarizing word. Mm-hmm. It's something that I think it's got to be up there, top 10. Oh my gosh, you don't want that. Even though I'm willing to bet most people are very unfamiliar with it. I think it's very similar to, in terms of the way that people avoid it, very similar to death and funerals. It's one of those things that people choose not to actually learn about until they're faced with it. And then at that point, you now have to try to concentrate and deal with a bunch of like really complicated mumbo jumbo and an urgency of a situation. That's not what you want to deal with, right? This is why we talk about estate planning and a bunch of other really important financial topics in the hope that people can try to learn about it so that they're more familiar with it. And to your point, recognizing that there is a way to navigate these things, not necessarily without pain, but to minimize the friction and at least put yourself in a position to be able to rebound better than you were when you started. I think the other reason why I wanted to talk about this is because it's one of those things that people avoid so much that there are really only like a handful of examples like in popular culture that I think really force people to do it. Like it's like celebrities that file for bankruptcy. TLC comes to mind, you know, in terms of how could you make all this money and then not be able to, and then they break it down and you'd be like, oh, actually, well, yeah. That seemed like a pretty obvious situation. Donald Trump, who is most famously known for filing bankruptcy several times over and over. And I think that just starts to shape people's perception of what this process is. And because it's mostly public figures and or celebrities, people don't really think of it as something that regular, normal people experience or have to go through. And that's just not true.
Yeah.
And so we will do some myth busting and some explaining in this episode. And I think this is hopefully a memory in a lot of people's minds where it's like, all right, if this happens to me or if I know someone who might be in need, now we're not starting from scratch. Now we're not starting from a place of fear. So
exactly. We talked about this briefly back in episode 174. It was our first edition of the Quick Dip, and we were covering multiple topics. And one of them was the rise of bankruptcy. We had been experiencing record levels of bankruptcy, both in the corporate realm and in the personal realm. Mm-hmm. And we were just talking about it. And my take was that the stigma is starting to fall apart. Like people are now questioning the morality of debt. And I said something like bankruptcy is the new divorce, meaning that, you know, it was unheard of or at least not encouraged before 15 years ago. And now, you know, you look at it and people are having divorce parties. They're saying that divorce is a means of relief. And they're both legal processes that were designed to protect people and businesses. One thing that's changing is the stigma around bankruptcy, and we have to be able to talk about it as it was intended to be talked about. Yeah. The reality is the U.S. has high risk credit. We offer people who have nothing but stable jobs, you know, every other paycheck, not a contract, just a job in an at-will state. We offer them access to loads and loads and loads of credit, of debt. And so there has to be a way to manage that. And that's what bankruptcy is. Like it's a means to get out of being over your head.
Yeah, I like that. Bankruptcy is the new divorce because I also think it is an indication of our general empowerment. Like we're understanding the different pathways and tools and resources that we have at our disposal, as opposed to what is typically offered to us through creditors. So typically it's like, if you're in debt, here's a different form of debt to help you get out of debt, even though if you listen to what we just said, that doesn't really make sense. Like if you found yourself in a situation, generally speaking, right? If a mismanagement or inability to pay your debt is what got you in debt, more debt is most likely not going to help you unless you have a wide variety of other tools at your disposal, right? But like if that's your only option, going deeper into debt, just in a different way is most likely not going to help you. But I like the idea that more people are talking about it and understanding, because that means more people recognize it as a pathway to getting out of debt, which I think is important, because I think there is a tendency for people to assume that bankruptcy is the absolute worst case scenario versus like staying in debt and continuing to allow that debt to compound and grow, especially if you have inconsistent or low income, because we know that that just leads to a lot of stress. I mean, that's a different kind of stress, a stress that I know very well. I'm going to just flat out say, like, people in my family have dealt with that. And I know what it does to the psyche. I know what it does to the at-home experience, to just your inability to sleep. You know, I think if you know what it feels like, or if you can imagine what it feels like to feel like you're about to get laid off, imagine that already happened 2-3 years down the line. You're still unable to pay it. But like, this is typically what people are feeling when they are faced with that. But there's also just the impact to the credit score, which I think, can be really hurtful and impactful for people, especially if they had their eyes set on buying a home or doing something that really was reliant on them having good credit. And so all of that to say.
But credit avoidance also impacts your credit score.
For sure.
Like there's already an impact to your credit score. There's going to be a further one if you can't pay off these bills and you continue to make late payments or minimum payments. And so, yes, that is a concern of people that their credit score will be ruined. But again, if you are in the situation where it's even an option for you, your credit score is already pretty bad.
And that's the thing. There is a tendency to really just dig deep and rely on faith and to just hold out. And I think what that does, unfortunately, in a lot of cases is it leads to just greater avoidance or longer avoidance. And what we're trying to do is to help people look at bankruptcy as a way to kind of stop the bleeding, to restructure your life, to maybe put yourself on a different track. And from an emotional standpoint, just as a way to lessen or lighten the mental toll, because debt is one of those things that just weighs on you. Avoidance kind of creates an additional layer of it. And bankruptcy, more than anything, is a bit of a mental health intervention. It's like a really great first step for a lot of people to take accountability, to say, you know what, I do have an option and I may not necessarily like it, but it's better than what I've been doing. Mm-hmm. And I'm putting myself in a better position to make different decisions and hopefully lead to a different outcome from the one I know for sure is going to happen if I continue down this path.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I think when we talk about bankruptcy, we don't need to just talk about it from a financial lens. The mental health aspect is really, really important. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the 3 chapters. I know most people are familiar with chapter 7, so we'll start there. And chapter 7, I like to think of it as like the fresh start, AKA like the liquidation. It's a clean break and it's for people who just can't keep up. They have limited income. They need to restructure their way out of all of their debt. And it's for individuals or households with low income, low assets who are overwhelmed. And that's the word I want to focus on, like overwhelmed by credit cards, personal loans, medical bills, you name it. Like you can't just have them. You need to be actually overwhelmed and they're going to make sure that you are. So here's how it works. You have a court trustee that reviews what you own and may sell any non-essential assets to pay your creditors back. So what chapter 7 does is wipes out your unsecured debt, which is stuff like credit cards, medical bills, personal loans. The other kind of debt, which is a secured debt, or debt backed by collateral, is debt that comes where
you have to put something on the line. Basically.
Yeah, basically.
You will lose something if you don't pay this debt. And it's not to say that, you wouldn't, like, you could lose, obviously, your credit score. There'll be an impact to your credit score, but like that's typically the difference between secured and unsecured debt.
Correct. It's debt that's backed by collateral. So that means if you stop paying it, the lender can take the thing, whether it's, a car, your house, could be furniture, if you've leased it or whatever it is. So you might lose some stuff.
Yeah. So let's talk about the timeline and the process a little bit. This timeline, we'll start there, is usually around 4 to 6 months for chapter 7. So it's not too long, but it starts with you taking a means test, which if you've ever heard the phrase living below your means, it's basically that. Like, how down bad are you? Let's quantify that so that you can essentially qualify for chapter 7 or not. To your point, if you don't pass this test, then they will determine that I actually think there's a way for you to get out of this, right? So we're not going to give you the pathway to this escape hatch or through this process. We think that there are some things that you can do and should be able to do, and they're going to hold you to that until you reach a certain lower point, which would likely force you to qualify. And let me just say this right off the bat, like, I'm not telling anyone or suggesting this for anyone. We're just explaining what this process looks like. But basically, they're looking at your income and they're looking at it relative to the income of other people who live in your state or area, right? So they can look at other people like you or like your household relative to others and make a determination as to whether or not you qualify based on the debts that you particularly owe. And once that's done, the first thing you'll do is you'll take a pretty short credit counseling course. This is all online. It is 100% mandatory. The good news is it actually doesn't take that long. And basically you'll be providing all kinds of paperwork. You show your income, your expenses relative to that, your debt, so that they have a clear understanding of whether or not you have the ability to manage your debts or not. And all of that is used to file. And the moment you file, there is a legal, what they call stay, which freezes everything. It's like, all right, we want to make an assessment of where you are in this moment so that we can make a determination as to whether or not you have the ability to pay. And during that time period, there's no more, the phone stops ringing. There's no collection calls. There's no more, wage garnishments. If that's something that you're dealing with, there's no more threats. And I don't use that word lightly, but like if you've ever had people chasing you down, all of that is essentially put on pause. You're put on a separate list for people who are like likely to be approved for bankruptcy. And a trustee is assigned to your case. And then a few weeks later, you'll have a short hearing, which is called a 341 meeting. And if everything checks out and nobody objects, then your qualifying debt, the debt that you qualify, gets discharge, meaning it is completely wiped out. And that's usually around 2 to 3 months. But, in some cases, everybody's case is going to be a little bit different. Now, assuming all goes well and you are approved for Chapter 7, this bankruptcy stays on your credit report for 10 years. There will be a negative impact to your credit score, but most people, if they do all things well, they can rebuild, kind of get back to where they are in about 2 to 3 years. And then the last thing is that you cannot file to go through this process again for another 8 years. So this truly is an opportunity for you to reset. So you'll start that process. Let's assume that in 3 to 4 months, you may be approved. Everything goes well. There's that bit of a pause in between. And then after that, you've got, this not ding, but like it's a big sort of clear indicator that on your credit report, you are someone that has borrowed a ton of money, has not been able to pay it back. And now there is an extended period of time, 10 years, a full decade, where that will be listed there. That does not mean that you won't get approved for any more credit.
Facts.
It just means that you are viewed differently than people who have not gone to the extent of filing for bankruptcy. So you can assume that you're not going to get very favorable terms because you have already gone through this process, been approved as someone who is clearly a credit risk to anyone who is willing to lend you money.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the specific costs, whether that's direct costs or subsequent costs of this process. But when you talk about that initial credit score drop, we're talking about 130 to 200 plus points, like off of your credit score. So if you're already struggling because of late payments and all of the other things that impact your credit score, subtract another 200 plus points from that because you filed for bankruptcy and it went through.
Yep.
The other thing I want to mention is that when you're taking that means test, to your point, they are looking at people or households in your similar zip code. If you are below the average income, then you qualify. If you are above it, then they start to look at your expenses.
Right.
And from there, they will determine if you qualify or not, or they'll recommend you for Chapter 13, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So that means test isn't meant to trap you. It's really meant to figure out what kind of help you actually need. Chapter 7 is for a true reset. Chapter 13 is for more of a rebuild. And so you can still qualify for bankruptcy even if you earn higher than average income than the people who live around you.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Chapter 13. You just said it. We think of it as more of like a structured do-over, right? It's not so much of a reset, as you will. I mean, it is, but it's a bit more structured, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The good news is, or one of the key differences, is that you get to keep your stuff through this process, but you will agree to a payment plan. So the way this works is you create a court supervised repayment plan, and the length of that payment plan is usually around 3 to 5 years. So you're filing for Chapter 13 and you're basically saying, let's restructure all of the debts that I have, and let's, for lack of a better word, consolidate them, or at least restructure them in a way that allows you to manage the repayment over a 3 to 5 year period. There is a bankruptcy trustee that oversees your payments and the distribution of those payments to the people or the creditors. And at the end of that term, any remaining eligible debts may be discharged. So this is usually for people who have steady income, right? So unlike Chapter 7, you have steady income, but you've fallen behind and you're trying to find a way to protect the assets that you have. In most cases, we're talking about your home. right? And this is also for people who just need a bit of a second chance, if you will, to restructure their finances. It is a slower process than Chapter 7, but for some people, it creates a bit of a bridge, if you will, between where they are without completely losing everything, but in most cases, like their home, and then really being down bad. Now, when we talk about the impact to your credit score, one of the other big differences between Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 is that with Chapter 7, the bankruptcy stays on your credit report for 10 years. With Chapter 13, it only stays on your report for 7 years. And during that time, you can still catch up on any missed mortgage payments or car loans without actually losing your home or your car. You have to stick to the budget that court-appointed trustee provides you or oversees with you. And that can feel kind of restrictive, if you can imagine, like somebody overseeing the way that you're spending money because you've agreed to go through this process and they're saying, well, no, you can't take this vacation. Certainly not while we're going through this 3 to 5 year period. But the good news is you still get to keep most, if not all, of your property, your home, your car, any other key assets that you have, so long as you stay current on your plan. So it's basically a way to essentially admit that you're overwhelmed, but you have assets. You're trying to find a way to keep those assets. You are promising to abide by a restructured sort of court overseen repayment plan. And if all goes well, when you're done, like you will then be, I don't want to say rewarded, but given some relief with respect to any remaining debts that you may have.
Yeah, this is the one that you see a lot of celebrities doing, especially the celebrities that are still working, the ones that are still touring or still getting an income from a different place.
Yeah.
Lil Kim filed for a Chapter 13 bankruptcy back in, I think it was 2018.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And that's the other thing about bankruptcy. So one of the costs is that it becomes part of the public record. And so you are disclosing your assets, you are disclosing your liabilities, and anyone can see it if they wanted to. Now, everybody ain't going to have TMZ writing a headline about you like celebrities do, but it is part of the public record. And so when Lil Kim filed, she had twice as many liabilities as she did assets and income. I think she had like $4 million in liabilities. She had $2 million worth of assets and was only making, I'm saying only because it's relative, about $20,000 a month. And so she filed for Chapter 13, which restructured that debt in a way that she could keep up with the payments. A lot of her debt was due to owed taxes, which we don't talk about a lot. Back taxes from people who had a couple good years in business but forgot to pay Uncle Sam.
I thought every year was going to be
right. They are usually doing Chapter 13 or the next example, which is Chapter 11, which is specifically for businesses or very high net worth people.
Yeah, I like Chapter 13. I'm not gonna lie, I like it. No, because I think it's one of those shining examples of how important finance plays a role, like in our country, like for everybody, business owners, people who have jobs, people who are entrepreneurs and have inconsistent income. Like it is a way of just accepting the fact that there's a variety of ways that you can live, and we want to create this pathway for everybody to essentially thrive. Like you still get a chance. Like it's a second chance for you to be able to bounce back, and you can do it multiple times, right? Like you might not necessarily get approved, but it is an option for you. And so that's why I'm bringing it up, because I do think, there are a lot of people who do have the means, and there's a bit of pride in the way where they don't want to have to put a stain, if you will, on their reputation. And if you can get past that and basically join the long list of other people who have gone through that, or at least are just willing to accept that sometimes life happens, this is an option for you. You do not have to lose it all, right? Like we've been talking a lot about these worst case scenario situations over the last couple of weeks for a reason, because these are tough times. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this. So that is Chapter 13.
And before we move on, I want to clarify, because I know somebody's out there probably thinking like, why wouldn't you just refinance your debt? Why wouldn't you just, get a credit counselor and consolidate and do it that way?
You might not get approved for that.
One, you might not get approved for that. Two, that doesn't protect the asset. So even if you go through that process, if you are late on a payment or, your bank starts getting antsy, your asset is not protected because you went the other way versus bankruptcy, which is legally protecting the asset while you work the repayment plan.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is that it's just not as strict. Like the reality is, even if you consolidate, even if you refinance, if you do want to take that vacation or, you do get some windfall money that you want to spend it a different way, you don't have to go through like a court appointed trustee to get permission for that. With Chapter 13, they are monitoring every dollar. They are wanting to make sure that you are paying your lenders, and your lenders actually have to agree on the terms. And so it's just a lot more structured than the other path. And some people need that, or that's the only choice they have left.
Yeah, I think anyone who asked that question has not been down bad enough to understand that, and those kinds of offers don't come your way anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
That's not an option anymore.
Yeah.
That's what you get when you're flush with cash and somebody's willing to see if you're willing to part ways with that cash in agreement for a bit of a finance game, which is that refinancing. So that's Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. I know the numbers are weird, which is also one of the reasons why in the past I delayed digging deep into this, because it's just confusing. The last one we're going to talk about is Chapter 11. And again, I'm willing to bet some people realize, I'm like, I didn't realize there was so many. Chapter 7, they just throw these words out there. Chapter 11, this is another kind of, or the third kind of bankruptcy. And I like to think of this as a bit of a business rebuild or like a corporate reorganization. And it's a very strategic way for businesses or very high income, high net worth individuals to accomplish the same thing as some of the other forms of bankruptcy. It's a bit more similar to Chapter 13. It is expensive. It is complicated, but it basically allows that business and that business owner to continue operations because they don't have to actually liquidate all of their assets. They're allowed to stay in business. And this is a bit of a stabilization process that allows them to
strategic stabilization,
sort of lighten the debt load a little bit, make sure that the people that borrowed them money get more of what they want before they go completely nuts on you. And this is what we mean, again, but when we say things like bankruptcy is not, just for failure. Like there's a time, and maybe you even can think of a few businesses who've gone through that process where it seemed very, for lack of a better word, casual or like strategic, right? It's like, no, we'd rather not do that. I think it's best for us to just go ahead and file, and we'll go through that process, and then we'll see you guys next week. But that has no impact on whatever. You're still going to stay at our hotel. If you got a flight booked with us, you can still stay with us. So the way it works is whichever business or organization it is still gets to stay in business, but they are proposing a reorganization plan. And it's basically saying, this is the debts that we owe. This is how we'd like to restructure it. And this is how we're going to move forward with our payments. That plan is essentially submitted to creditors who need to vote on whether or not they want to accept that plan and accept taking partial payments, pennies on the dollar to what they owe, or run the risk of waiting it out, which means they might not get anything if that company eventually gets sort of smothered or suffocated by the actual debts that they owe, and then the creditors don't get anything. For the business, it is incredibly time consuming. It's very expensive. If you can imagine the visual that I have in my head, which is a bunch of CFOs and a huge lawyer team sitting around crunching numbers and everybody agreeing respectively what one party is willing to do and what other parties are willing to accept. And personally, unless you like having a bunch of lawyers in your pocket, this is likely not for you. But some companies that are large enough that can accommodate that are certainly willing to do that, because that is far better than the actual worst case scenario, which is completely going out of business and having no future earnings and all of their bonuses going poof.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney and court fees. It's very, very expensive.
Yeah.
But when you compare it to the interest that they're paying on debts, it makes sense for them. And it's surprisingly common, to your point. Like a lot of the companies that we admire today, Delta, Ed Bastian was like Time 100 most important people this year. And he hasn't been the CEO forever, but Delta has filed for Chapter 11, Hertz, Bed Bath & Beyond, J. Crew, Revlon. All these companies have filed for Chapter 11, continued their operations, and then came out on the other side.
Yep.
This is just like a Tuesday in the business world. But when we talk about personal finances, it becomes something completely different.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that we have to remember, that none of these chapters are punishments. They're really just tools and pathways. Whatever chapter that you get or that you fall into is based on the situation that you have. It's based on where you are, what you earn, and what you're willing to commit to. Knowing what these mean in advance isn't just helpful, but it really changes the way that you think about being in debt, the way that you think about the businesses that lenders and creditors are in, and the way you think about our legal system, which is designed to resolve conflicts between two different parties. There are conflicts between lenders and receivers of debt all the time. And we are no longer in the biblical times. We're no longer in debtor's prison time. Back in the biblical times, it was an eye for an eye. Like if you took my eye, I get to take yours. And now there's this whole process. Now it isn't free, which we'll get into in a second, but there's this whole process that is meant to resolve conflicts that occur every single day.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about how much it costs. And I'll just add a quick little disclaimer here, because again, I'm not trying to get anyone actually excited about this process, because it is pretty affordable. I'm not going to lie.
Filing fees.
The filing fees
are
right?
affordable.
So the fees are basically paid to the court when you actually file, irrespective of whichever version you have. But the fees are different based on the actual version. So for Chapter 7, and this is as of 2024, the filing fees for bankruptcy are $338. For Chapter 13, it is $313. For Chapter 11, we're basically starting at $1,738 plus. Now, these fees are not state by state. This is set by the federal government. They do not vary by state, but there are some things that vary state by state. And
this is where you need to tune in.
One of the things, or I would say one of the most important things, would be the exemptions. And that's a state by state decision around which property you are allowed to keep as you are going through this process. Some states are more strict than others. Some are much more lenient in allowing you to keep and are much more willing to navigate the process while allowing you to keep whatever assets that you have. The other thing that is different, and we mentioned this as we were going through the process, is that it's state by state. One, they're looking at the income threshold. So what is considered a qualifying income for your household in New York is going to be very different for that in California or North Dakota or Illinois or whatever city or state that you live in. Attorney fees. Obviously, attorneys are going to be different. There's a big difference between the attorney that has a billboard that we see on the way to the airport. There's Better Call Saul. And then there's the big boys who offer you just white glove service and, just depending on how much you're willing to pay. So it's up to you. But when we're looking at attorney fees, Chapter 7 is usually going to cost you around $1,000 to $2,500. For Chapter 13, it's around $3,000 to $6,000, which is usually baked into the repayment plan itself. Again, that's a bit of a restructuring versus Chapter 7, which is you're paying someone up front. They're going to manage and that overlook that process for you. And then there's Chapter 11, which we've mentioned before. That's tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And again, that's just depending on the complexity of the organization. Would not surprise me at all if there are millions of dollars at stake for some of the larger companies that we've spoken about who have successfully navigated multiple bankruptcies over the years. So most people do not do this alone, though. And this is not like a TurboTax situation, even though it would not surprise me in the coming years if we do start to see that, just because of the rise.
For Chapter 7, for sure.
Yeah, well, there's been such a rise in these kinds of services, and certainly with AI, it would not surprise me at all. But most people hire an attorney, especially for Chapter 13 or 11, right? Because we're talking about more complex situations. We're talking about corporate organizations, and that paperwork can just be crazy. That process is legally sensitive. This is usually not something you want to manage on your own. There's a point, and there's certainly value in having a trustee, somebody who has done this likely hundreds of times before, to help guide you through that process.
There's a lot more back and forth in Chapter 13 and Chapter 11. You remember Chapter 7 is just liquidating. They're going to take your stuff. They're going to sell what is non-essential, and that is determined at the state level. And then they're going to give that money to creditors and wipe away the remaining of debt. So that's pretty straightforward. To your point, I can see that being automated, or at least something that you can just sign up for online, fill out some forms like prenups at this point.
Oh, yeah.
Chapter 13 and Chapter 11 require all that back and forth. They require creditors to approve. You have to list the assets you're trying to save. So yeah, most people are hiring an attorney because it's so legally sensitive. So we've gotten into the cost of just like filing and the logistics of going through the court system. Those are not the only costs to bankruptcy. And I know people have been waiting on this since the episode started because it makes it sound so easy. But realistically, there's stress involved in this entire process. I mentioned this earlier, but filing means being completely transparent about your finances and facing some hard truths about your behavior, about how you're perceived, about how you're treated and how you're looked at. There's the credit score drop. We talked about upwards of 200 points, which makes a huge difference on anything that you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. They're a public record. Like I mentioned earlier, they are available through internet search, even though it's not, widely broadcasted unless you are a celebrity or something. It's harder to get loans. It's harder to get credit cards, favorable rates. In some cases, landlords will reject applicants who have recent bankruptcy on their record. Job applications, like employers can check your credit for certain jobs. A lot of people don't, but there are certainly some, especially now, that are looking for your financial history as a means to determine your trustworthiness and your ability to handle very sensitive company documents. And so, there's a lot of costs and ripple effects in areas of your life that you may not even consider when you're initially looking for this relief. But at the same time, you have to weigh it. Like if you're already in default, if you're already getting collection calls, if you're already losing sleep, you really have to weigh the price that you're paying for the life that you're currently living against the consequences of what would happen if you file for bankruptcy. There is no scenario where you come out unscathed. Yeah. To your point about taking other people's money, like that's the agreement. You gonna feel something, but it doesn't have to be complete denial and a complete tanking of your credit worthiness and history. You can go through this process where it is painful, but it's manageable, or you can go the other way where it's painful and it may not be manageable because there's nothing on record that says that it should be.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say before we go to some final thoughts is we've brought it up in a handful of our most recent episodes. The theme here is we recognize that these are tough times and we really want to help people identify and understand the different options that are available to them, whether it's bankruptcy, whether it's van life, whether it's moving to another city and or state and taking advantage of some kind of incentive program, or taking the leap and trying to navigate moving abroad because you're just over it altogether. This is just another one of those options. And when it comes to thinking about what pushes someone to that point, I just want to reinforce the fact that this is not a moral failing. The vast majority of people who are faced with these kinds of issues are there because of medical debt. Mm-hmm. It's just that simple. And that could be an accident that was not your fault. It could be a preventable disease. I don't really care or think it's worthy of analysis to try to figure out which one was preventable. It doesn't matter. Like you still ended up in the same position where you owe more than you have and more than you actually earn. And it just reaches a breaking point where you have to find something. And so this is just another pathway to be able to navigate that situation. And I say that because I just think it's really important to remind people to don't waste time like spiraling through this shame if it was not your fault. Take advantage of the programs and the tools and the systems and the plans and all those things that are available. And in a lot of cases, this is something that could be favorable and save you a bunch of time on the back end, right? Like, not to make it sound trivial, but 7 to 10 years of something bad on your credit report is not like the end of the world.
No.
You might have 30, 40, 50 years after that. Yeah. And it might just be something that you did. It might be something that you eventually forget about or even be grateful for. And so I think that's the really important part. I mean, we're talking about it. We're not trying to make light of it. I'm not really trying to encourage anyone to do it as a way to continue to be irresponsible or to look at the filing fee in the process and say, you know what, that's easy for me to do and I'd rather do that. Obviously, we want to encourage people to continue to make smart decisions, but more importantly, knowing what we know about our audience, this is more about like not allowing the shame to lead to continued avoidance. I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times before. The only thing that compounds more than interest is neglect. Yeah. And if you continue to do that, it's just going to make the situation worse.
Yeah. When I think about our mission to inspire better conversations about money, I think about this conversation because it may not be you that needs to explore these options. But the reality is times are tough. People are hungry for alternatives. And when somebody is coming to you and talking to you about their situation because they see you as a trusted mentor, an ear that doesn't judge them or isn't going to make them feel worse about a mistake or several mistakes that they've made. I want you to feel comfortable positioning bankruptcy as a viable option. People are hungry for alternatives, and bankruptcy, when understood properly, is an alternative to mental stress and worst case scenario, feeling like you don't belong here or that it's so bad that you need to end your life or do something that's harmful, right? This is really, really important conversations that we need to be equipped and comfortable talking to with our loved ones, our friends who are in situations. And I really think about it like the emergency exit on a plane. Like nobody boards a plane planning to use the emergency exit. They go over the instructions every single time. But if that cabin fills with smoke, if that pressure drops, you're grateful that it's there. You're grateful that you listened half-assedly. The emergency exit seating have to know what to do to open the door. Like it's one of those things that we have to get more comfortable talking to people about and reassuring them that whatever option they have in their head ain't worse than this.
I want to be a little bit more clear. For those of us who are part of the sandwich generation, you are under great stress. You're already going through tough times. You're dealing with layoffs. Maybe you're dealing with, a 2-income household that's already gone down to 1. Maybe you still have a parent or multiple parents that you have to deal with. This is a viable option, not just for people like you, but maybe for that parent that you are financially supporting. Right. So if this is a process that they can go through and as a result, it leads to more cash flow and a healthier, stronger financial foundation in your household, that is a win. Right. And so, yes, there may be some stigma attached to it, but it's tolerable, in my opinion, and it's legal. And so I'd rather you do that. I'd rather you explore that option or explore that conversation. Let's just start there with that loved one, as opposed to continuing to stress and carry this burden, right? Exactly. So it's a tool, it's a tactic, and maybe now we kind of understand, why certain people speak about it so casually, because they've been there before multiple times. And, so
because every lender ain't all good, right? Predatory lending is real. To your point, a lot of these people did not do this on purpose. They weren't just irresponsible. A bank, a viable financial institution told them that they could afford whatever the loan is, whether it's a 32% auto loan or a 17% payday loan that has compounded into now 80%, whatever it is. There's not always this responsibility that lenders carry when they're talking about credit. And that's why this process exists. That's why it's so successful most of the time from a creditor's perspective, because they know they were wrong too. Like they know they didn't do all their due diligence. And so this is just the cost of doing business to wipe the debt away. It was never real to begin with. And they've more than made their money on the interest alone. And so when we talk about how to frame and position bankruptcy for somebody who is desperate for a solution, not someone who's just trying to hustle their way through. Them people exist, but that's not who we're talking to.
Yeah.
It really is about seeing the whole picture and not just what you've heard or assumed or think you know about bankruptcy. Amen. Let the church say amen. My pastor used to say amen, lights.
I gotta find some organ music. Yes. But all I got is an air horn.
That ain't the same.
That ain't the same.
I mean, I'll take it. Okay. I like the validation. Well, all right, y'all. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. As you heard, I like the validation. So if you like what you heard, let us know by leaving a 5-star review on any of your favorite podcast platforms, or drop a comment below and keep the conversation going. If you're thinking about a little file here and there, I want to know. You don't have to tell us all your business, but I do kind of want to know. We will see y'all next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.